I'd like to pretend to be a proper preacher by beginning the message with a text. Last time the text was from John Lennon. Later this year, the text will be an edgy limerick. But today, I'm going full preacher. And the text is from the New Testament, specifically the 13th chapter of St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. And now abideth faith, hope, and charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. I don't know what to say about faith and hope, because it depends on what you have faith in and what you hope for. But charity seems like something we can sink our teeth into, and St. Paul said it's the greatest, so here we go. As a kid, I associated the word charity with organizations such as Boys Town and March of Dimes, what we would today call nonprofits. So when I heard that Bible verse, faith, hope, and charity, it made no sense to me. Faith, hope, and nonprofits. But then someone said that charity really meant love, and that made more sense, except that love is a rather all-purpose general word. So today we'll stick with charity and the word charitable as our points of departure. The obvious place to look for a greater understanding of what was meant by charity in the Bible passage is by looking at the passage, the broader passage in which the word is embedded. And there we find that charity involves patience, kindness, the avoidance of envy, of boastfulness, and of selfishness. That's my paraphrase, by the way. I offered on the assumption that something is almost always lost in the original, in my humble opinion. So, in the 2 millennia since St. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, the classic writing on charity is that of the 12th century Spanish Jewish sage Maimonides, I guess it's Maimonides, who defined 8 levels of charity. Here's the list starting from the least, number 8, to the most virtuous. The least is when donations are given grudgingly. Number 7, when one gives less than he should but does so cheerfully. Then 6, when one gives directly to the poor upon being asked. 5, when one gives directly to the poor without being asked. Then I'll jump a couple of steps to number 2, giving assistance in such a way that the giver and the recipient are unknown to each other. And number 1, the highest form of charity is to help sustain a person before they become impoverished by offering a substantial gift in a dignified manner, or by extending a suitable loan, or by helping them find employment or establish themselves in business so as to make it unnecessary for them to become dependent on others. That list is obviously about generosity, gift-giving, benevolence, the kind of thing that, when it's a lot of money, we call philanthropy. And the list's powerful wisdom arises from the emphasis in it on aspects other than the size of the gift. The cheerfulness of the giver, the lack of self-interest, concern for the personal well-being of the recipient, and so on. I call this giving charity. But there's another facet of charity, as we use the word today, and it's no doubt part of what St. Paul had in mind as well. Let me introduce it by quoting something that the Pulitzer Prize-winning essayist Jennifer Senior wrote in a recent article in The Atlantic magazine. She spoke of her own personal shortcomings, but then, I quote, she said, "On the positive ledger of things, I'm a loyal friend. I am an empathetic friend. I seldom, if ever, judge. Tell me you murdered your mother, and I'll say, gee, you must have really been mad at her." End of quote. So that definitely is a kind of charity, I guess. How charitable, but it's a different kind of charity from what Maimonides was referring to. I'll call it forgiving charity. What is being given is a pass, the benefit of the doubt. In short, there are two ways we use the word charity: giving and forgiving. Giving is in response to need and involves money or some other kind of material support. Forgiving is generally on the heels of somebody having behaved poorly or demonstrated a shortcoming, and it involves not imposing some kind of judgment or negative consequence that might be arguably justified. Within the English-speaking Christian tradition, the words that are most closely related to forgiving charity are forbearance, mercy, pardon, grace. Let's talk about grace for a moment. It's an important term within the British class system that prevailed when the Bible was first translated into English. In the context of the British aristocracy, even today, dukes and archbishops are addressed as Your Grace. It's the honorific that falls just below Your Royal Highness. In that context, Your Grace means something like, you're such a special person, it's merciful of you even to acknowledge my existence, Your Grace. In a similar vein, when preachers speak of the Lord's grace, God's grace, they're not saying that God is graceful. They're not saying that he's a graceful dancer, a smooth dancer. They're referring to God as gracious, as in the prayers that begin with, Our gracious Heavenly Father. God is seen as giving us the benefit of the doubt, putting up with us as being more merciful than we deserve. Lovely. Then there's the hymn, Amazing Grace. When singing it, one starts by declaring oneself to be a wretch, making it clear that the peace and security and eternal bliss that are described later in the hymn are undeserved, available only because God is charitable. The point of view shows up in the Lord's Prayer as well. Forgive our transgressions even as we forgive those who transgress against us. The implication of God being forgiving if we ask so. Therefore, we should be forgiving too. I shared a personal story from this pulpit a few years ago, and it's relevant again here. So it dates to when I was maybe 12 years of age, riding in the car with my dad, who was a minister. We spotted a man living on the street, perhaps a wino, all the trappings of a wretch, whatever. I said something to my father like, hey, look at that guy. And my dad's reply was, there but for the grace of God go I. My dad was reminding us that we should not think of ourselves as better than that guy. It was an assertion of humility and acknowledgement that we should never feel entitled. On the other hand, that assertion could reasonably leave the wino asking, why didn't God bother to give me some grace too? As you may guess, I really don't know what to make of the notion of God's grace. In fact, I don't know what to make of God, period. But I do know that if I felt obliged to worship some kind of God, I'd opt for one who is gracious rather than spiteful. Though at various times in the Bible, God is described as having both of those attributes. But for me, the bottom line is not about God anyway. It's about us, specifically that it's good for us to show grace to our fellow men, to give others the benefit of the doubt. Within my field of psychology, there's an important conceptual framework that's relevant here, having to do with the attributions we make for the behavior of ourselves and others. That is, the explanations we embrace in accounting for behavior. Attributions are subject to a number of biases, such as the person like me, if I'm more likely to give a friendly attribution if the person is like me, whether or not the person is physically attractive, and so on. When we talk about prejudice and bias, we're really talking about which persons we do and which persons we do not make charitable attributions about. In a just world, our willingness to be charitable would apply equally to all people. One interesting twist to this is the fact that it can be easier for us to romanticize needy people who are so far away from us that we cannot see their warts. Imagine this scenario. It's an all-white, middle-sized, middle American town. The local evangelicals are certainly not lacking in charitable impulses, but they're much more willing to support a missionary hospital in Africa than they are for their tax monies to be used for affordable medical care in the poor neighborhood in their own town. In that distance, somehow it's distance that fosters generosity, or so it seems. It's an interesting twist. The fact is, of course, that each of us needs to be viewed charitably sometimes. Who among us is not, at the very least, hard to put up with at times? Good fences may make good neighbors, but strict accountability does not make for close, long-term relationships. The people whom I'm closest to are the people whom I need most to ignore my shortcomings, to give me a second chance, or two, or three, to not be too preoccupied with whether I'm pulling my weight. And those are the persons who most need me to do the same for them. But these are not simple matters. How much patience and forgiveness can I feel entitled to receive from anyone? And what about when truly bad behavior is involved, perhaps even a crime? At what point do we get into the realm of accountability, the realm of the legal system even? First, a joke told to me by a friend who was trying to explain the meaning of the Yiddish word chutzpah. He suggested that the ultimate example of chutzpah is the man who murders both of his parents, then appeals to the court's mercy on the basis, he appeals to the court for mercy on the basis that he's an orphan. That's chutzpah. Good luck with that. The business of giving someone the benefit of the doubt plays out within the judicial system at three levels. First of all, at booking, at trial, and at sentencing. Regarding the first, police and state's attorneys sometimes behave charitably when they're deciding whether to book an offense and to prosecute. When our daughter was a senior in high school, a state trooper caught her driving 80 miles an hour, but gave her a ticket for failure to wear a seatbelt rather than speeding, even though she was already wearing a seatbelt. She didn't get the speeding ticket. It was charitable of him. So the second stage of the judicial process, when someone's prosecuted and tried, there's the question of guilt or innocence, at which point we come upon the mantra, innocent until proven guilty. That sounds pretty charitable, especially so if you say that charity is baked into the system, especially enough so that you can say that charity is based into the system, especially when you add the phrase, beyond a reasonable doubt. Third, the sentencing stage, where it's understood that not all persons who are clearly guilty of the same crime deserve exactly the same consequences. An umbrella term for such special considerations is mitigating circumstances. One big mitigating circumstance is age. And indeed, the entire juvenile court system grew out of our understanding that some bad behaviors should be chalked up to immaturity, boys will be boys, and all that. Another mitigating circumstance is motivation. Consider, for instance, when an 18-year-old steals food to feed his kid brothers and sisters who would otherwise go hungry if he didn't do so. In light of the motive, the court might reasonably show mercy. The legal standard, not guilty by reason of insanity, is also something that sort of addresses, broadly speaking, the mitigating circumstances that might curb the way a crime is dealt with. Of course, the most charitable aspects of the criminal justice system do not always work. Notwithstanding the innocent until proven guilty rule, a lot of people who have been found guilty of murder have later been exonerated by DNA evidence, as I'm sure you know. Evidence that it comes up sometimes after decades of incarceration. And there is the kind of bias I mentioned earlier. I mentioned the policeman who had responded charitably when he caught our teenager driving at 80 miles an hour. Our daughter was respectable and respectful. She was driving a late model Volvo. She and her other passengers were, guess what? White. Change any of those factors, and the policeman's actions might have been different. Let me give you a more disturbing example. In this case, a white man shoots a black man dead. It's clear who did it, so the questions are how and why. But rather than delving into the background of the apparent killer, the detectives instead spend their energies ferreting out any imperfectness on the black victim's background. It's as if the police are aiming to orchestrate a defense based on the claim that the victim deserved his fate, as if that were a mitigating circumstance with respect to murder. And we doubt that detectives would have taken that approach if the crime had been black on white. Being white should not be a mitigating circumstance. Charity should be constrained by justice, by a sense of fairness and equity. Let me share another example. This one acknowledges the emotional aspects of this, and all of these issues are not solely rational by a long shot. They are also emotional. It involved, in this instance, a friend of mine, a woman, a bit older than myself. She was probably at the time 60, younger than I now am, but she was 60 then, and she had a nephew whom she had raised as her own son. At about age 30, the nephew was in a car accident and was arrested for driving under the influence. Like a caring mother, the woman attended the trial, hoping that he would be treated charitably. But then, when she was in the courtroom, awaiting the beginning of the trial, something happened that set her spinning. An attractive young woman was brought into the courtroom in a wheelchair. A woman who, it turned out, would be handicapped for the rest of her life, thanks to the nephew having crashed into her car when drunk. It made it awfully hard for my friend to maintain her default charitable mode toward her nephew. Not that she was happy that his sentence was severe, but things had changed. It was the victim who commanded the greater sympathy, the greater charitable impulses. I was very aware of this, hearing her talk about her day as she left the office. She was actually my secretary. As she left the office to go to the court, and then when she came back to talk about her experience. She left it talking about wishing for the best for her nephew and wanting to be there for him. It's not the way she was talking when she came home after having seen the woman in the wheelchair. These matters can be complex. Sometimes there are no easy answers. There are problems with a radical 24/7 approach to charity. I see 4 ways that things can be complex, 4 kinds of conundrums. First, sometimes being charitable to one person involves being uncharitable to another. The white killer versus the black victim. My friend's nephew versus the woman injured in the car accident he caused. In a child custody dispute, charity to the father or charity to the mother. Giving the benefit of the doubt to the father, giving the benefit of the doubt to the mother, and so on. Second, sometimes acts can be so charitable that they run afoul of the law. I think of the case 3 years ago, which you may have read about. I read the Boston paper, and it's popping up again now because it's just getting dragged out forever. But it happened 3 years ago that a district judge in Massachusetts realized that ICE, the immigration police, that ICE was coming after an undocumented immigrant who was appearing in her court. She did the charitable thing. She excused the immigrant and let a bailiff sneak him out the back door so that he wouldn't be there when ICE came for him. And of course, the feds accused the judge of a crime for having done so, for having abetted the escape of a criminal, so to speak. This is a particularly naughty instance, as you can imagine, because in general, judges are generally the law within their own courtrooms. And she was the judge in her own courtroom doing this, and she's being accused of a crime for what she did. Very naughty case. As I say, charitable acts can, in some cases, be at least technically illegal. Third, charity and accountability run at cross purposes with each other at times. There is, after all, at least a smidgen of truth to the adage, spare the rod and spoil the child. In my first semester as a full-time college teacher, back in 1971, I taught a class of 525 students, exactly, class roll, 525 on it. If a wave of love and compassion washed over me at the end of the semester, and I decided to give all 525 of them A+, that act of mass charity would not have been especially admirable, would it? For starters, it would have been unfair to those few students who actually earned an A+, and incidentally, it would have brought a stunning, quick end to my career as a teacher. I would have been summoned to the department chair's office, and my plea that I was just being charitable would not have impressed anybody. Similarly, consider the 43 senators who voted not to impeach then President Trump on February 12th of 2021 for his post-election behaviors that led up to the January 6th riots. We might say that those senators were behaving charitably to Mr. Trump, but not all of us admire them for having done so, do we? Or consider the news story a few years ago about a bunch of teenage boys who engaged in a competition over how many different girls they'd have sex with in their final semester in high school, notches on the bedpost kind of thing. The parents of those boys, when it all came to light, tried to pass it off as boys will be boys. That is, they were being charitable and chalking the poor behavior up to immaturity, something you'd grow out of. But we can understand how the parents of the victimized girls begged to differ, right? Here's another conundrum. As a psychologist, I'm aware that we mental health professionals often give mixed messages to severely ill patients regarding how much responsibility they should take for their acts. Sometimes we quite charitably say, it was not your fault that you behaved poorly. It was a product of your illness, not guilty by reason of insanity, so to speak. Even if it's not technically an insanity, it's an extenuating circumstance. But at other times, we may say to the very, very same patient, you must control your behavior. You've got to take responsibility on this. Mixed messages, not so? The fourth problem with an all charity, all the time approach is that sometimes forgiveness can be part of an abject failure to deal with a difficult, dangerous situation. Consider, for instance, the example of partner abuse. When one traces such relationships across time, often there have been many episodes of abuse, each of which was followed by an abject, perhaps even sincere, apology on the part of the abuser. And often the pattern is one in which the victim has forgiven him repeatedly, How lovely. Except that this is also a pattern that sometimes culminates in the man murdering the long-suffering partner. Need I say more? The general point, of course, is that if you make a general policy to give people the benefit of the doubt, you'll make a lot of errors, sometimes really bad errors. If you turn a blind eye to someone else's faults, you are not necessarily seeing the world clearly. And your willful blindness may be, as I say, costly. If you're thinking about entering into some kind of partnership with someone, it's surely not a good idea to be in denial about their shortcomings, right? For that matter, there's a blessing box down there. When you put food into the blessing box or bring it for the church to be put in there, some of that food, may go to someone who's as able to buy food as you are. Right? Charity involves risk. Both kinds of charity, giving and forgiving charity, involve risk. It's hard to be generous to the needy while still being absolutely sure that none of your gifts will benefit the merely greedy. Life is uncertain. Even when we keep our eyes wide open, sometimes things don't turn out well. But if your greatest concern is that your giving and forgiving must always go well, always have a happy ending, you'll probably never act charitably to anyone. Lurking behind the notion of forgiving charity is the question of whether people ever change, whether people ever outgrow their weaknesses, conquer their demons, whatever. I have two answers. Number one, yes, change, personal growth, redemption, whatever you want to call it, does happen. Answer number two, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Now, it may seem to you that those two answers are in conflict with one another. And if you notice that they are, all I can say is, congratulations, you're paying very good attention. They are in conflict with one another. There is no simple answer. The more I think about this business of virtues, the more convinced I am that the two basic virtues are justice and charity, the latter encompassing both giving charity and forgiving charity, both generosity and grace. But the basic complexity of life comes in the fact that justice and charity sometimes point in different directions. It's indeed not healthy to be stuck in a model of suspicion, grudges, and resentment. Forgiveness can indeed be good both for the forgiver and for the forgiven. But to just talk about the wonderfulness of a giving spirit is to tell only part of the story. So it's time for me to wind things up, isn't it? We started out with Maimonides' 8 levels of charity, which turned out to be about the giving kind of charity. But that, we noted, is just one kind. There's also forgiving. Turns out that there was another less well-known 12th century sage named Paul Blaney, whom scholars also think had a list of 8 levels, but in his case were of forgiving charity. As with Maimonides, Paul Blaney started with number 8, which is the least virtuous form, namely charity bestowed at no cost or risk to oneself upon someone who is closely attached to oneself. Example, a governor pardons a friend who has been convicted of having rigged the ballot box in a way that favored the governor's election. As I say, the least virtuous kind of charity, number 8 on the list. What about numbers 7 through 1? Well, as I say, this is 12th century stuff, and the documents have deteriorated through the years. The worms got to Paul Blaney's documents more readily than Maimonides' documents. Scholars and archivists are still looking for a clean copy of the entire list, But from Paul Blaney's other writings, we know that by the time you get to the most virtuous forms of charity, it will involve risk and vulnerability. For example, when you forgive someone, knowing that in time it may prove to have been, the person may prove to have been unworthy of your forgiveness, knowing that you may eventually regret it. At least that's, from what I can tell, what Paul Blaney's was getting at in his elusive worm-eaten list. We may never know for sure. Thank you.